I must begin my story with the night that changed everything. For me, the night my late mother appeared in my dream. It wasn't the kind of fleeting, nonsensical dream that vanishes like smoke at dawn. No. This was vivid, clear, and hauntingly real. Even now, years later, I can still see her face as though she were standing in front of me. Her soft hands reaching out, her lips trembling with urgency. I was lying in bed, restless, my bones aching from the long day. Old age has a way of turning every little movement into a battle, and that night I felt particularly weary. I drifted in and out of shallow sleep until suddenly I was standing in the middle of my childhood home, the house where my mother raised me after my father passed away. The wallpaper was the same faded yellow. The scent of bread baking in the small oven filled the air, and the sound of her humming carried through the kitchen. Then I saw her, my mother, her hair tied neatly back as she always wore it, her apron slightly flour-stained, and those eyes, those deep brown eyes that always carried both love and worry. She looked at me, not as though I were an old man, but as though I were still her little boy. The one she scolded gently when I scraped my knees, the one she prayed over when I had fever. She reached for my hands, her touch warm, astonishingly real. My throat tightened. I knew she had been gone for decades. Yet, there she was. "Son," she whispered, her voice trembling as though the words carried a burden. "Don't go tomorrow. Danger awaits you." The words echoed like thunder in my mind. Don't go tomorrow. I woke up in a cold sweat. The room was dark, and for a moment, I thought I could still smell the bread, hear her humming. My heart raced as I sat upright, gripping the sheets, trying to make sense of it. I told myself it was just a dream, a trick of the mind, perhaps the byproduct of old memories surfacing in the fragile hours of the night. But there was something in her eyes in that dream, something too urgent to ignore. It wasn't just a motherly warning born of habit, felt like a command, a desperate plea from beyond the grave. I spent the rest of that night unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling, replaying her words over and over. By dawn, I was exhausted, but one thought wouldn't leave me. Tomorrow was supposed to be important. I had made plans. For weeks, I had been looking forward to a small trip. A few old friends from the neighborhood had invited me to join them on a bus ride to the countryside. They wanted to visit an old church and spend the day reminiscing about the past. I had said yes, even though my body was tired, because, truth be told, I was tired of being alone. The walls of my house had grown heavy with silence. The laughter of friends seemed like medicine I badly needed. Yet, now, my mother's words clung to me like chains. Don't go tomorrow. I wrestled with myself all morning. Logic told me it was superstition, nothing more than a dream. But my heart remembered the countless times she had been right about things, even little things. My mother had always had a way of sensing danger, of knowing when something wasn't right. I remembered once, as a boy, I had begged to swim in the river with other children. She had forbidden it, insisting the water was not safe. I sulked and thought her cruel. Later that day, I learned one of the boys had nearly drowned. She had saved me then. And now, could it be that she was saving me again? By midday, I felt torn in half. My friends were expecting me. I had promised I would come. A part of me feared they would laugh if I told them the reason I stayed behind. Who believes an old man who claims his dead mother came to him in a dream? They would pity me, call me lonely, fragile, perhaps even senile. But the other part of me, my instincts, my very bones told me not to dismiss it. The hours passed slowly. I stared at the clock, each tick sounding louder than the last. When it was finally time to leave, I found myself frozen at the door, my coat in my hands, my heart pounding. I whispered to myself, what if she was right? What if I go and I never come back? And then I made the decision. Against all reason, against my pride, against the fear of ridicule, I stayed. I sat back down, placed the coat aside, and let the bus leave without me. I didn't know then that this choice would save my life. I didn't know that while I sat in my quiet living room, listening to the rain tap against the windows, tragedy, was unfolding only miles away. But before I reveal that part, let me tell you something important. That night, in that dream, I felt more alive, more shaken, more vulnerable than I had in years. My mother's love reached through time and death itself to find me, and her warning struck the deepest chord in my heart. I will never forget her voice, her trembling lips, the fear in her eyes. That was the night everything changed for me. The night I learned that even the grave cannot silence a mother's love. And the very next day, I would discover just how true that was. After that haunting dream of my mother, I found myself thinking not only about the warning she gave me, but about the life we had shared, the roots of my very being. Sometimes, when the past suddenly invades the present, it forces you to revisit the long road that brought you here. And so, if you'll allow me, I will take you back to where it all began. I was born in a small village in the north of England, just after the war. Times were hard, though as a child I didn't quite understand the weight of poverty, only understood hunger and the longing for warmth. My father had been a quiet man, strong with his hands, working in the mills until illness took him far too soon. I was only 6 when we buried him, and from that day on, my mother became everything, my shield, my guide, my world. We lived in a narrow terraced house, with cracked walls and drafts that seeped through no matter how tightly we stuffed the gaps with old rags. Winters were bitter, and I can still remember the sharp sting of cold air on my cheeks as I lay under thin blankets, listening to my mother pacing in the kitchen, wondering how to stretch a few coins into a week's worth of food. She was a remarkable woman. She worked long hours, scrubbing floors and mending clothes for wealthier families. But no matter how tired she was, she never let despair rule her. She used to say, "Son, dignity isn't about what you own. It's about how you carry yourself, even when you own nothing." It was her voice, her principles, that shaped me into the man I became. When I was a boy, my mother often denied herself meals just so I could have enough. I didn't realize it then. I only understood it years later. She'd say she wasn't hungry, or that she had already eaten at work. But I know now that wasn't true. She was starving herself quietly so I could grow strong. That kind of sacrifice brands itself into your soul. I carried those lessons with me into adulthood. I worked hard, sometimes too hard, because I couldn't bear the thought of living in the same shadow of want that she had endured. I began working in the mills as a young man, just like my father, the sound of machines roaring in my ears from dawn till dusk. It was hard, dirty labor, but every penny felt like a step closer to security. In my early 20s, I met Margaret, the woman who would become my wife. She wasn't extraordinary in the way novels described. She wasn't wealthy or glamorous, but she had a laugh that made even the heaviest day feel lighter, and eyes that told me she'd walk with me through fire if she had to. We married in a small church, with only a few guests and modest rings, but I never once regretted that choice. Together, we built a life. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. We had children, 2 sons and a daughter. And as any parent knows, raising children is both the greatest joy and the heaviest burden. There were nights I came home from the factory so tired, my legs felt like stone, but when I saw their little faces, the exhaustion melted away. I sacrificed dreams quietly, the way my mother had done. I had once hoped to become a teacher, to work with books instead of machines. But those ambitions gave way to the reality of bills, food, and shoes that children constantly outgrow. I told myself, they will have their chance. If I must work until my body breaks, so be it. And so, the years rolled on. My children grew, each with their own tempers and talents. We weren't wealthy, but I made sure they never went hungry the way I had. Every Christmas, no matter how tight things were, Margaret and I found a way to put a small gift under the tree. The look of surprise on their faces was worth every sacrifice. But time, as it does, moves quickly. The children grew into adults, and one by one, they left the house. At first, the silence was unbearable. I would come home to rooms that once rang with laughter, only to find stillness. Margaret filled the quiet with knitting and radio music, and I buried myself in work. We learned to live as two again, though it felt like part of us had been scattered into the world. Then came the hardest blow of all, Margaret's passing. She had been my anchor, my partner in every storm, and suddenly, I was left adrift. Losing her was like losing half of myself. I remember lying awake the night after her funeral, staring at the empty side of the bed, wondering how life expected me to go on. It was in those years of widowhood that I began to feel my mother's presence more strongly again. Perhaps grief opens doors that are usually shut. Perhaps, when we are most broken, we are also most receptive. I cannot explain it in scientific terms. All I know is that I would sometimes wake in the night certain that she was there, watching over me, just as she had when I was a boy. That brings me to the present, the man I am today. An old widower, with hands scarred by decades of work, with children who live lives of their own. I am not bitter. I am proud of the sacrifices I made. Yet, I have often felt forgotten, as though the world kept moving while I was left behind in a corner. Loneliness, I discovered, is a heavier weight than poverty ever was. And it was in that state alone, vulnerable, longing for connection, that my mother came back to me in that dream. Not as a vague shadow, not as a trick of memory, but as vividly as the last time I saw her alive. She came, I believe, because she knew I would need her once more. Her warning that night did more than save me from what was to come. It reminded me of who I am, of where I came from, of the unbroken thread of love and sacrifice that has guided me my whole life. When you understand my past, the poverty, the sacrifices, the devotion of a mother who never gave up, will understand why her words held such weight for me. They weren't just words spoken in a dream. They were the continuation of a promise she had made long ago, to protect me, no matter what. After that night, when my mother came to me in a dream, her voice echoing with urgency, I carried her warning like a stone in my chest. Don't go tomorrow. Danger awaits you. The words circled endlessly in my mind. When the morning came and I chose not to leave the house, I thought the matter might be finished. But life has a way of stirring doubt, of poking holes in your convictions, until you wonder whether you've lost your senses. The first wave of doubt came from myself. As the hours ticked by and nothing unusual happened within the walls of my quiet home, I began to wonder if I'd made a fool of myself. The bus had left without me. My friends had gone to their excursion in the countryside, and I was left behind, staring out the window as the rain streaked down the glass. A voice inside me whispered, "Perhaps you've gone soft in the head. An old man spooked by a dream. That's what people will think." I made myself a cup of tea, my hands trembling as I lifted the kettle. I stared at the steam curling upward, and for a moment, I felt like the loneliest man alive. Later that day, the phone rang. It was my daughter, checking in. She asked why I sounded so strange, and I told her about the dream, hesitant, half embarrassed. She fell silent for a moment, then laughed softly. "Dad, you're just lonely. You've been thinking about Grandma too much. Dreams don't mean anything." Her words stung, though I knew she didn't mean harm. To her, I was simply an aging man clinging to the past. But to me, it was real. I could still see my mother's eyes, still hear the tremor in her voice. By evening, news began to spread of the bus accident. The very bus my friends had taken that morning. I sat frozen as the announcer's voice described the wreckage, the overturned vehicle on the wet country road, the lives lost. My breath caught in my throat. Names were read out, names I recognized, people I had spoken to only days before. I should have been there. I would have been there if not for her warning. The weight of that realization pressed on me. Relief, horror, grief, gratitude, gale tangled together until I could hardly breathe. I whispered aloud into the stillness of my living room, "Thank you, Mom." But survival comes with its own burden. While others mourned openly, gathered together to comfort one another, I sat alone in my chair, trembling with the knowledge that I had been spared. I wanted to tell someone, anyone, that my mother's spirit had saved me. But who would believe such a thing? They would nod politely, then dismiss me as senile, or worse, unstable. The days that followed were heavy. I attended the funerals, standing among weeping families, my heart aching for my friends. People looked at me strangely, as though wondering why I had not been on that bus. I overheard someone whisper, "Lucky old man missed it by chance. If only they knew." Yet, the more I held the truth inside, the more isolated I felt. My children, busy with their own lives, offered little comfort. They visited less often, each wrapped in their own concerns. Sometimes, when they did come, caught the impatience in their eyes when I spoke too long about the past. My daughter once sighed, "Dad, you always talk about Grandma as if she was still here. You have to move on." Move on. The words cut deeper than she realized. How does one move on when the very person who raised you seems to still walk beside you, warning, guiding, protecting? As the weeks passed, small incidents began to gnaw at me. A forgotten birthday call from my son. A dismissive remark from my daughter about old people and their superstitions. Even my grandchildren, who once clung to my knee for stories, now barely looked up from their phones when I spoke. Each slight was small on its own, but together they built a mountain of loneliness and hurt. I began to wonder if the world had left me behind, if I had become little more than a relic, tolerated but not valued. At night, I lay awake, listening to the creaks of the house. Sometimes I thought I heard my mother's footsteps in the hallway, soft and deliberate. Sometimes I smelled bread baking, though the oven was cold. Perhaps it was my mind playing tricks. Or perhaps she was still near. One evening, after a strained phone call with my son, in which he told me bluntly that he couldn't babysit me all the time, I sat at the kitchen table and wept. It wasn't just his words, it was the tone, the dismissal. I had spent my life breaking my body to provide for them, and now, in my frailty, I felt like a burden. The conflict within me grew sharper. On one side, I had this unshakable sense that my mother had intervened, that her love was powerful enough to cross even death. On the other, I had the cold reality of being treated as though my words meant nothing, as though I were a foolish old man. The more I insisted, gently, that my dream had meaning, the more my children pulled away. My daughter once said, "Dad, you scare me when you talk like that. You sound not yourself, not myself." Those words echoed in me. Who was I, if not the sum of the love my mother had poured into me, the sacrifices I had made for my family, the stories etched into my very bones? The crescendo of conflict wasn't just about the dream. It was about the slow, painful realization that while my mother's presence remained strong, the living around me treated me as if I were fading, disappearing, and so, tension mounted on all sides inside my heart, in my home, in my family. The warning that saved my life had also drawn a line between me and the rest of the world. I was alive because of it, but in surviving, I felt more alone than ever. The storm was building, I could feel it, and I knew, deep down, that something was coming, a moment when all the pain, the doubt, the loneliness, and the lingering presence of my mother would collide. That moment, the breaking point, would arrive sooner than I expected. The weeks after the accident dragged on like heavy chains. Each day, I woke with the same mixture of gratitude and guilt. Gratitude that I was alive, guilt that my friends were not. Their faces visited me in silence whenever I closed my eyes. Faces that once laughed over tea. Faces that once sang old songs with me on long walks. Now they were buried beneath the soil, and I was left to carry their memory. I thought, foolishly, perhaps, that my children would draw closer after the accident, that they would see how fragile life was, how close they had come to losing me, and they would want to cherish whatever time we had left. But instead, distance grew. Their visits became less frequent, their calls shorter, and when they did see me, there was an impatience in their voices I could not ignore. One evening, I tried to explain to my son how real my mother's warning had been. She came to me, "Lad, as clear as you're standing before me now." Her words saved me. He sighed, rubbed his forehead, and muttered, "Dad, you have to stop this. It's not healthy. People dream all the time. It doesn't mean the dead are speaking to us." But it did mean something, I insisted. I felt her. I know it. He looked at me then, not with love, not even with patience, but with something colder pity. "You're a lonely dad. That's all. Maybe you should think about moving into a home where you won't be so isolated. You're scaring us with this talk. A home." The word cut me like a knife. My own son, the boy I had raised, the boy whose shoes I had polished for school when I had no money for my own, was suggesting I be tucked away, hidden from view. That night, I sat in my armchair, staring at the empty walls. My house, once filled with children's laughter and Margaret's warm humming, now felt like a prison. I whispered to the shadows, "Ma'am, I don't know how much more I can take." The rupture came a few days later. It was my granddaughter's birthday. I had saved a little money to buy her a small gift, an old-fashioned watch, delicate, something she might treasure when she was older. I wrapped it carefully in paper and tied it with string, proud of myself for finding something meaningful. When I arrived at my son's house, the celebration was already in full swing. Children ran about with balloons, music played, and the table was covered in food. For a moment, I felt hope. Perhaps here, surrounded by family, I would feel less alone. But as soon as I entered, I sensed it. The glances, the forced smiles. My son barely looked at me, too busy chatting with his friends. My daughter-in-law greeted me with that polite, thin-lipped smile that said, "We're only tolerating you." I handed the gift to my granddaughter, who smiled faintly before running off to play. Later, I noticed a watch still lying unopened on a chair, forgotten among brighter, flashier toys. I sat quietly in the corner, listening to the laughter around me, and felt like a ghost at my own family's table. No one asked me to join their conversations. No one sat beside me. At one point, I overheard my son's wife whisper to him, not softly enough, "He just sits there, staring. It's unsettling." The words pierced me deeper than any blade. I was unsettling. After all I had given, all I had sacrificed, I was now a burden, a shadow they wished would fade away. Then came the final blow. As the evening wore on, my son approached me. His face was tight, his voice low so others wouldn't hear. "Dad, I think it's best if you don't come to these gatherings for a while. The kids get uncomfortable. Mom's dream talk, it's strange for them. We need some space." For a moment, I thought I had misheard. I blinked, stared at him, waiting for him to laugh, to take it back, but he didn't. "You don't want me here?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. He shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my eyes. "It's not that, it's better this way, better this way." I felt my chest tighten, as though the very air had been stolen from me. I nodded slowly, stood up, and without another word, I walked out of the house. The night air was cold, biting, but I hardly felt it. My legs trembled as I made my way home, each step heavier than the last. When I reached my house, I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, my body shaking. I wanted to scream, to cry, to rage, but no sound came, only silence. I went to my bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed, and buried my face in my hands. Memories flooded me, the long hours in the factory, the sacrifices, the nights I went without so my children could have enough. And now, in the twilight of my life, I was cast aside, unwanted, a burden to those I had given everything for. That was my breaking point. Not the loneliness, not the guilt, not even the strange looks when I spoke of my dream. It was the rejection, the cold, undeniable truth that my own son, my own flesh and blood, had no room for me at his table. I wept, then, like I hadn't wept in years. Not the quiet tears of an old man, but the gut-wrenching sobs of a child who has lost everything. And in the middle of my grief, I felt her again, my mother. Not in a dream this time, but in the quiet presence that settled around me, as if invisible arms wrapped around my shoulders. As if her voice whispered, "Hold on, son. This is not the end." It was the faintest flicker of comfort in a night of unbearable pain. But it kept me breathing, kept me from collapsing entirely. That night, I understood the true weight of her warning. She hadn't just saved me from death on that bus. She was saving me still from despair, from losing myself entirely. The rupture had come, and it nearly destroyed me. But in that breaking, something else began to stir, something that would soon change the course of everything. I thought the night of my son's rejection would break me completely. I thought perhaps that was where my story would end. An old man sitting alone in a darkened house, unwanted, carrying memories no one cared to hear. But life, strange as it is, has a way of twisting just when you think the path is sealed. The days following that night were quiet to quiet. I barely left the house. I found myself moving from bed to chair, from chair to bed, with no sense of purpose. The walls of my home seemed to close in around me. Sometimes I would catch my reflection in the mirror and hardly recognize the man staring back. Hollow eyes, shoulders bent, a shadow of who I once was. But there was something else. Amidst the silence, I began to notice small things, signs perhaps, or just coincidences, depending on how one chooses to see them. One morning, I woke to the smell of fresh bread. The oven was cold, untouched, yet the fragrance was there, filling the kitchen. Another evening, as I sat weeping quietly, I heard humming soft, familiar, the same tune my mother used to sing as she worked. At first, I thought I was losing my mind. Perhaps grief had finally tipped me into delusion. But the more these moments happened, the more I began to believe they were not tricks of the brain. My mother was near. She had not only saved me from the bus accident, she was still guiding me, still pushing me toward something I had yet to understand. Then came the letter. It arrived in an envelope, yellowed slightly at the edges, with handwriting I recognized instantly, even though I hadn't seen it in decades. My mother's handwriting. My hand shook as I tore it open, half convinced it was a cruel joke, but inside was a letter addressed to me, dated years before her death, sealed away by some relative or solicitor, and only now delivered through a clerical delay. The letter was simple, but the words were powerful. My dear son, if you are reading this, I am gone from this world. But I want you to know something I never told you in life. I saved what little I could over the years. It is not much, but it is yours, meant to give you comfort in the years when I cannot. Do not let loneliness or hardship steal your spirit. You are stronger than you know, and one day you will see that I am still with you. At the bottom was a note about a small account she had opened, money hidden away, little by little, never mentioned, never touched. I sat there, staring at the letter, tears streaming down my face. The money itself wasn't large by modern standards, but to me, it was a treasure, not just the funds, but the meaning. My mother, even after all these years, was still providing for me, still ensuring I would not be left destitute. I went to the bank the next day, and the clerk, after some confusion, confirmed it. The account existed, and it was mine. Enough to make a difference, enough to give me choices I thought I no longer had. For the first time in months, I felt a spark of life. With that small inheritance, I decided to do something bold. I had always dreamed, quietly, of returning to my village, of seeing the house where I grew up, the places that held my earliest memories. For years, I told myself it wasn't practical, that I was too old, too weak. But now, with my mother's words echoing in my ears, I knew I had to go. The trip was not easy on my body, but when I arrived, I felt something shift inside me. The village had changed. Of course, new buildings stood where old ones had fallen. Streets were paved where dirt roads once wound. Yet, some things remained the same. The church still stood tall, its bells ringing across the fields. The small shop still smelled faintly of tobacco and sweets. And the house, my house, though worn and repainted, still carried the bones of my childhood. I stood there for a long while, leaning on my cane, letting memories wash over me. And I swear, as I gazed at that little house, I felt my mother's hand on my shoulder. But the revivolta, the true twist, was still to come. While visiting, I wandered into the local community hall, curious to see if it still bustled with life. To my surprise, I found a group of elderly men and women gathered there, laughing, drinking tea, playing cards. They welcomed me instantly, as if I were an old friend returned. When they learned who I was, some even remembered my mother, speaking of her kindness, her strength. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of belonging. These people, those strangers, treated me with respect. They listened when I spoke, asked questions about my stories, and smiled warmly. One man clapped my shoulder and said, "You're one of us, mate. You belong here." I began visiting the hall every week. Slowly, my days filled again with purpose, conversations, games, even small volunteer work helping others who were lonelier than me. The laughter I thought I had lost forever returned, echoing not from my past but from the present. Word of my renewed life reached my children eventually. At first, they were distant still, perhaps guilty, perhaps confused by my change. But as months passed, curiosity overcame them. They visited me, surprised to find me stronger, brighter, surrounded by friends. My son, the very one who had told me not to come around, looked at me with different eyes. "You seem happier, Dad," he admitted awkwardly one afternoon. I smiled at him, not with bitterness, but with peace. "I am. Your grandmother saw to that." The irony was sharp. They had dismissed my dream, mocked my words, yet everything that followed, the survival, the letter, the inheritance, the new life had come from her. She had not only warned me of danger, she had carried me into a new chapter. The poetic justice was not in revenge, but in revelation. I had been cast aside by my own family, yet found belonging among strangers who treated me with dignity. I had been silenced when I spoke of my mother, yet she had the last word. Her presence undeniable in the twists of fate that saved me. Sometimes, justice does not come in thunder and lightning. Sometimes, it comes quietly, in a sealed envelope, in a forgotten account, in the warmth of unexpected companionship. And so, the revolta of my story is this. I did not wither in rejection. I found life again. My mother's love reached across the years to save me not only from death, but from despair. She gave me a second chance, and I chose to live it fully. When I look back on the night my mother appeared in my dream, I no longer see it as something strange or unbelievable. I see it as a gift. At the time, I was fragile, broken by rejection, carrying the weight of years where love felt more like a memory than a reality. That dream was not just a warning that saved my life from an accident, it was the beginning of my rediscovery. I used to think my life had already ended in every way that mattered. Yes, my heart still beat, my lungs still filled with air, but I felt invisible. My children saw me as a burden. Society treated me as obsolete, and I convinced myself that the only thing left was waiting for death quietly. But my mother would not allow that. Even from beyond the grave, she refused to let me disappear without dignity. That is perhaps the greatest lesson she ever gave me. That love, true love, is not bound by time, by distance, or even by death. It is eternal, weaving itself into the very fabric of our being, guiding us even when we no longer expect it. I carried that realization with me every day after discovering her letter and her hidden savings. What at first seemed like mere money quickly became something much greater. It was a symbol, a reminder that someone believed I was worth caring for. That small inheritance gave me more than financial comfort. It gave me the courage to live again, and live I did. At the community hall, I became part of something bigger than myself. I shared meals with people who laughed with me, not at me. I found friends who asked about my day and truly wanted to hear the answer. We played cards. We argued over trivial things. We celebrated birthdays together. I found warmth in places I never expected. For years, I believed family was only blood. That belief chained me to pain because blood had turned its back on me. But in that hall, surrounded by strangers who soon became dear friends, I learned that family is chosen. Family is made by love, by care, by presence. The people who sit by your side when everyone else walks away, that is family. Do not misunderstand me, I still love my children. A father's heart does not erase love so easily. But I learned something important. I do not need their approval to have worth. I do not need their attention to feel alive. For too long, I begged for scraps of affection, when all along, the world was offering me banquets of kindness in unexpected places. And as time passed, something surprising happened. My children began to return, out of obligation, but out of curiosity. They saw me happy, content, surrounded by others who valued me. That unsettled them. They had convinced themselves that I would wither without them, that I had no life beyond their presence. But when they saw me thriving, something shifted. My son came one afternoon, awkward and hesitant. He sat across from me, hands clasped, eyes lowered. "I don't know how you've done it, Dad," he said, "but you seem better, stronger." I looked at him, and for the first time in years, I did not feel small under his gaze. I smiled and said, "Your grandmother never really left me. She reminded me that I still had life to live." He said nothing for a long while, but his eyes softened. I think in that moment he realized the depth of what he had done, the rejection, the cruelty. Maybe guilt haunted him. Maybe he envied the peace I had found. Either way, the balance between us shifted. I was no longer the beggar at the gate of my own family. I was a man standing tall again, with or without their acceptance. That is the second great lesson I wish to leave. Your worth is not defined by those who fail to see it. Too many elders spend their final years believing the lies whispered by neglect, that they are useless, that they are forgotten, that they are nothing. But the truth is this: we are all more than the cruelty we endure. The love of my mother saved me from death. The kindness of strangers saved me from despair. But in the end, I saved myself by choosing to believe I was still worthy of life. I want to speak directly now to anyone who has ever felt cast aside, abandoned, or invisible. You are not alone. Even if the people you gave everything to have turned away, even if the family you raised has forgotten your sacrifices, you still matter. Your story is not over until you decide it is. Life has a strange way of offering second chances, sometimes disguised as hardship, sometimes wrapped in sorrow. My second chance came through a dream, through the words of a mother who loved me fiercely. Yours may come through a friend, a neighbor, or even a stranger who smiles at you on a lonely day. Do not close yourself to it. Do not believe that the world is finished with you. When I returned to my village, when I stood before the house of my childhood, I felt my mother's hand on my shoulder. I felt her presence stronger than ever, and in that moment, I understood something profound. Death is not the end, not of love, not of connection. The ones we truly love stay with us, guiding, warning, comforting. That dream, that letter, that journey, they were all proof that life is bigger than what we see, and love is stronger than what we lose. Now, in the twilight of my years, I find myself at peace. I am no longer haunted by the rejection of my children. I am no longer broken by loneliness. I live with gratitude, with laughter, with stories to share. And when my own time comes to leave this world, I will go knowing that love carried me further than pain ever could. If there is a final message I want to leave behind, it is this: do not measure your worth by the eyes of those who failed to see you. Do not surrender your dignity to those who treat you as less. Remember the ones who loved you truly, who sacrificed for you, who whispered encouragement into your soul. And if you ever feel lost, close your eyes, listen carefully. You might hear them still. I heard my mother, and it saved my life. Maybe, if you listen, you will hear someone who loves you too. Because sometimes, blood is not family. Sometimes, family is love. And love never